All right. So this morning we're going to look at the entire 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. Now, I know that some of you are used to seeing it on the screen. If you have your Bibles, or if it's on your phone, that's fine too. But if you have your Bibles, go to 1 Corinthians. I'm in the New Testament. 1 Samuel 17, and you can do that. I have some copies here, though, of 1 Samuel 17. If it would be helpful to you, raise your hand. Got one over here, Malik, when you get a minute, where you can just look at it with me in its entirety. How many of you think I can preach on the whole chapter in 30 minutes? Chuck's got faith in me. Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate that. I think I can. One over here, Malik. Right over here. And anybody else who'd like a copy? And I didn't make one for every single person, but I didn't think I'd probably need all of them. So 1 Samuel 17. Now, you all know the story of David and Goliath, right? I mean, you heard it from Sunday school. So David killed Goliath in the name of the Lord, and everybody's happy, and we all go home, and the Sunday school story, is kind of that's what we understand, that's what we heard. And fundamentally and basically that's correct, but there's so much more to the story of David and Goliath than that. And so what I want us to do is I want us to look at some things maybe that we haven't looked at maybe in the past or hadn't thought of before. Sometimes we make these characters out to be perfect. They're not. Malik just read the scripture about David confessing all of his sins and all the problems that he had, and pleading before the Lord not to leave him, and to restore himself and his salvation and so forth. So we already know that David wasn't perfect even down the road, and he wasn't exactly perfect even in this story, and you'll see what I mean. Not necessarily in a bad way, but just understand that David was a human being, just like you and me. So we got to keep that in mind when we look at this story. Now, the title I used was Everything to Gain or Nothing to Lose. All of these statements are really actual questions. The title's a question and the points are questions. Another way to put it is your glass half full or half empty? And maybe you can determine that for yourself. I don't know. You might need to ask someone close to you if they see you as a half full or half empty type person. But we do all tend sometimes to be the half empty. See, we can look across here. We have people in every section. And we could say, well, it's half empty. But we also could say it's half full. And it's just as easy to be positive as it is to be negative. So, and we don't need to be negative, right? We need to be positive. And so that's the thing that we need to kind of understand as we get into this story. So I'm going to read through it. I'll probably stop here and there, and we'll look at some different things. So beginning with verse 1, it says, Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched their tent or their camp at Ephes-dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. Now, here's an important statement. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites occupied another, with the valley in between. Now, I don't know, I know we have some military people here, and they understand the importance of taking the higher ground, right? To take the higher ground. And so this is what occurred. We had one army that's the Philistines. They were on one hill, and the Israelites were on the other hill, and then there's this valley, okay? So part of the standoff was who's going to go down into the valley and charge the other army. And whoever did that first would put themselves in a position of weakness, at least for the time being, and maybe enough time to get beat, to end up losing that war. So instead, they just sort of stared at each other across the valley. Now, apparently this valley wasn't huge, and if I recall, I believe I saw this valley when I went to Israel, and it's not great big, so you could hear what they were saying. So they were, to be quite honest, they were basically yelling obscenities at each other. Anything they could think of to try to intimidate the other army, that's what they were doing. All right? So in some ways, they were looking at the war from the perspective of being half empty. I mean, they were kind of fearful. Both armies. We think of the Israelites being fearful because of Goliath. He'll come into the picture here in a minute. But really, both armies had some fear. Both of them were feeling a bit negative because nobody wanted to go down and take a chance of going into the valley first. So here they are, standing on each hill, looking at each other, and nothing's happening except they're just yelling at each other. All right? Boy, does that sound familiar? In today's world, we just stand on the hill, yelling at the people on the other hill, and we don't want to get down in the valley and get that dialogue going. And, I want to just mention something right here. This probably could be a whole sermon, but see, one of the things we need to understand is none of us in this room are colorblind. We're not colorblind. But we are culture blind. And in order for us to understand each other, we have to both go down into the valley. And we need to talk to each other and share with each other our own cultures and the things that we've been through. I don't see Malik any different than I see anybody else. But you know what? Some things that have happened in his life that haven't happened in my life. Some things that have happened in my life haven't happened in his. So he and I need to get down in the valley and just sit there a minute across from each other. We need to stop yelling at each other on the hill and come down and just talk to each other. Say, Malik, share with me your background. You can say yes right there. Yes. Okay, thank you. All right. And so when I tell you say yes, you can say yes. Okay, can I have all your money? Say yes. Oh, he said yes. You can have mine too. We'll just exchange. The idea is that there is an exchange between people, and it doesn't. I don't care who we're talking about. That's important. So we've got to come down into that valley. We got to sit down. We got to talk. So there's the standoff. So here's how they decided to settle the standoff. Let's get our biggest guy, and the Philistines said, let's get our biggest guy and get him up here, and we'll just have a challenge one-on-one. And whoever wins then wins the war. And that's, again, kind of what we do. We bring out our biggest gun, and we figure, we can either scare him to death or we can beat him, and then we win. Everything's got to be win-win. I'm sorry, win-lose. What we want is win-win. And we can do that. And we can prove that. And we can show that. We can model that. Right here. On this campus. In this room. In this church. So anyway, Goliath comes out. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He actually was almost 10 feet tall. I don't know who the tallest human ever was, but it's pretty close to that. And so he's pretty tall. Over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale of armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. I think that was like 100 pounds or so. That's a lot of weight. On his legs he wore bronze greaves and had a bronze javelin, and it was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, that's huge, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. Now I think that's 20 some odd pounds or something like that. There's some information on the back of that sheet that might help you get those numbers right. Anyway, they were all heavy, very heavy. And they were so heavy that the shield bearer went out ahead of him. So he had so much stuff on, he couldn't even carry his own shield, so he had a shield bearer carry it out there for him. Now, there's another reason why he did that we probably hadn't thought of. One is that when someone grows that tall, one of the side effects of being that big is blurry vision. Now, we don't know that this was true or if this is a fact, but it's certainly possible, and it may be the reason why he sent the bearer, the shield bearer, out ahead of him. And Goliath just stood there and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, or are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, they would not have known whether he had blurry vision or not, and maybe he didn't, for all I know. But one possibility is that was the case. So basically, what Goliath was doing, he was standing at a distance. I mean, they couldn't tell one way or the other. He was just big. He was just huge. As a matter of fact, what we'll find out is that Goliath was actually trained from his youth. Now, let me give you a today analogy of that. As a football coach, one of the first things you pick up on is size. Now, for me, bigger's not better and smaller's not better and better's better. However, it's hard not to notice someone who is big for their age. So Goliath, if he existed today, he would be one of those guys that started getting trained and recruited probably in kindergarten. This is a big kid. We're going to get him going now. Which is what happens today sometimes, not always a good thing. But nevertheless, this is Goliath, trained from his youth, probably because he was big in stature. So the question we need to ask is, too big to hit or too big to miss? Do you see? Is it half full or half empty? If you saw the Rocky movies, I don't know if you saw the Rocky movies, but in one of the Rocky movies, I believe it was the second one, they pitted Hulk Hogan, they didn't call him Hulk Hogan, but he had another name, the wrestler, against Rocky. All right? Now this is when you see, if you saw this, or when you do see it, if you ever watch it, you definitely see the David and Goliath thing going on. Because Rocky's like here, and Hulk Hogan is like way up here, huge muscles, great big physique. Rocky, he's built good, but he looks pretty small compared to Hulk Hogan. Now, that's where you have to make the decision. Is this guy too big to hit, or is he too big to miss? I don't know whether you realize this or not, but God is all in on the impossible. I have faced impossible challenges all my life. I'm not going to say that God always granted me, a victory, because that's up to Him. I don't produce results, He produces results. But I will tell you that one of the keys to us being in the right frame of mind is deciding that it may look impossible, but hey, it's too big to miss. Another way to put it is, what do we got to lose? I mean, where are we? The only way we can go is up. All right? Even if we bounce around a little bit. Up pretty much is the direction. That's kind of where we were 4 years ago when I started coaching at SCA. We had 12 guys. We lost all our games. Only way we had to go was up. Right? And that's what we need to understand. This is, I think, what David began to understand, and I think he understood it actually before he got to Goliath, because what else did he defeat? A bear, a lion? Yeah. Now, we just got back from the zoo last weekend. We went up to the zoo after church on Sunday, or went up to Omaha, and then on Monday went to the zoo. And we got on this tram that takes you over the top, which actually, once you do that, you can go home. Because you see everything. But one of the things we saw is a lion, the king of the jungle type lion, not a lioness. We saw one of those too, didn't we? Or was it two, and they got the big manes and all that, sitting on top of the hill. Now, that's scary stuff. And of course, Jennifer wanted to go over and pet the lion. And I said, well, you got two problems. One is you got to find a way to get from the tram over there. And then when you get over there, you've got to figure out how to get back over here fast enough after you pet it not to get eaten. Okay. But, to her, it was like, hey, too big to miss. Too big to miss. And that's how we need to look at things. We got big problems all the time. But you know what? They're too big to miss. We just need to take a shot. We need to take the shot. So many people are not willing to take the shot. It's just easier, to do something else. No, we're not going to take that shot. It's just too big. Too big to handle. Too big to hit. That's the wrong way to go about this. We got to look at it from the standpoint of too big to miss. And that's what Rocky did. And Rocky ultimately picked Hulk Hogan up and threw him over the ropes. Now, I don't know how in the world they must have had some ropes or something that we couldn't see to help him. I don't know. But anyway, he ended up throwing Hulk Hogan over the ropes. And so we need to have that kind of an attitude. All right, now, we know that David was taking some food to his brothers. And that's what we find in verses 12 through 19. I'm not going to take time to read those. I think you're aware of what was going on there. His father had sent him to his brothers to take some food to them. So it says verse 20 says, early in the morning David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out into battle positions, shouting war cry. Now, understand, this was not down in the valley. The battle position, everything was sort of trying to fake each other out. Well, we're going to go over here and get in this battle position, see if that scares them, and then we're going to go over here and stand here and see if that scares them. And they were shouting. They're still shouting at each other. Now, not an arrow had been shot, not a spear had been thrown, not a sword had been used, but they were all getting in battle positions. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, now this is important, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted as usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they ran from him in great fear. So if you can picture this, they're in their battle lines, whatever that means. They're in there. I had a young man the first year that I coached, and he got the most elusive award. And the reason is because anytime somebody's going to hit him, he eluded it, Malik. He was like, and he used to crack me up because he'd get in his position, ready, set, and he'd go the other way. And the guy that was going to block him, and football just wasn't for him. It's a hard sport. But that's what the Israelites were doing. They were getting their battle positions, and then Goliath would yell his defiance, and they'd all run. And David noticed this, of course. And then, look what happens. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family, his father's family, from taxes in Israel. You can say yes. Thank you. Now, why? That's a good place to say yes. Look what David's going to get. Great wealth. He's going to get to marry the king's daughter. And he's going to be exempt from the taxes. You and I would just do it for the taxes. You know, right? Right? David asks the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? And they tell him again. And David starts getting cocky, you know. Or maybe that's not the right word. Maybe he's just confident. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Which, by the way, that's an obscenity. That was an obscenity back then. That should defy the armies of a living God. And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. Now his brothers get all upset with him and they tell him to be quiet. But he turns away. And in verse 30 it says, he then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. What was the same matter? He's asking, hey, what am I going to get if I kill this guy? He's starting to get that half full going on. He's starting to get that, hey, this is too big to miss going on. You know, he's getting some confidence. And the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. So now we're getting ready to set the stage here. And the next question that I want you to think about as we read the next passage, part of the passage, was David a lowly shepherd or an ambitious servant? So David says to Saul, let no one lose heart on the account of this Philistine. Your servant, he refers to himself as a servant, will go out and fight him. And Saul replied, said, hey, you can't do that. You're too young. You're just a boy. This guy's been fighting from his youth. See, I told you he'd been brought up as a warrior. He'd been trained since his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And he goes into the part where he killed the lion and the bear. He struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth, and so on and so forth. Now he apparently grabbed the lion by its hair. Now, that's pretty brave if you ask me. I don't think I would have gone over there. Jennifer would have had to gone over by herself. And if she'd needed a rescue, I'd have probably just called 911. Sorry, I love you. But not that much. No, that's not true. Don't you dare say yes. All right. So your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Because he defied the armies of who? The living God. The Lord who delivered me from the lion and from the bear will also deliver me from the Philistine. So David was both. Yes, he was a lowly shepherd. That brings humility to his life. The shepherd was the low man on the totem pole. They're the ones that would have picketed for $15 an hour, like we're seeing today, you know, and understandable. So he was a lowly shepherd, but he was also the ambitious servant. You know, it's not all bad to have a little bit of ambition, as long as your ambition is to be the servant of the Lord. If that's your ambition, then you're good. It's okay to be ambitious. And this is in that way. And that's what that's exactly what David was. So, Saul finally says to David, "Go and the Lord be with you." However, Saul kind of missed the point here, because he says, "Go and let the Lord be with you," and then he did something that, well, he didn't really need to do, but he did it anyway. And the third question is, did David come in his strength or in God's strength? Now, did he have all that armor that Saul was about to put on him when he went and faced the lion and the bear? Absolutely not. It says, then Saul dressed him in his own tunic, put a coat of armor on him and bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he had not used them. He says, "I can't go in these." He says to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." He took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones, and you're familiar with this part, from the stream, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and put his sling in his hand, and approached the Philistine. Now, let me tell you something about, there's a lot of different things about those 5 stones, and there's even some meanings to each one of those 5 stones, and I don't have time to go into all that. But one of the things that we miss is that he put 5 stones in there because he still had to show humility. See, there's a difference between 1 stone. In other words, he had to admit, hey, I am human. And if I'm really trusting God, well, I need to be humble and not think that just 1 stone that I'll... See, we kind of turn that around and use it the other way, and I get that. But David did have some humility to go along with his ambition. He knew he was imperfect. And yet he still trusted God. There is a tension between that faith and that unbelief. Help me to believe. I believe, but help my unbelief in the New Testament. So David had that perfect balance. And so, obviously, with humility, he goes not in his own strength, but in God's strength. If he'd have put on all that armor, he'd have been going in his own strength. And you know what? He could barely walk around in it. The last question is this: was David about his kingdom or God's kingdom? Well, let's find out. We see, that he got dressed in all of his stuff and then decided not to use that. So then David comes to the Philistine. And of course, in the meantime, the Philistine is still cursing David and the army. Apparently, Philistines had a number of gods, so they could sort of pick one, and maybe sounds like that Philistine used all of his gods to curse David. Said he was going to feed his flesh to the birds there and all this kind of stuff. Now, notice Goliath is still standing. There's nowhere in here where it says Goliath started moving toward David. Goliath is still standing there. That's why I'm wondering if maybe he had some kind of a optical issue of some kind. I don't know if that's the case, or maybe he was just too big to move very fast. I mean, that's all speculation. That's not inspired word. That's just, some thoughts that we can have about this. And David says to the Philistine, "You come with me with the sword and the spear and the javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut your head off." Now here's where we need to stop again and go, let me ask you a question. Did David have a sword? No, he didn't have a sword. So David has no sword. And he says, "I'm going to cut your head off." I mean, to me, that's amazing. So there's a lot of confidence going on here as well. This balance, this tension between humility and confidence is so incredibly important. When I say things about God, I try to say it humbly just in case I'm wrong. But I still want to say it because it might be right too. And hopefully I can say it confidently. And this is where David was. "So I'm going to strike you down, cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth and the whole world, you will know there is a God in Israel. We're back to, okay, what we're demonstrating here is that there is a God. Now, whether or not you take on this challenge and complete it, I should say we, but I am kind of talking to you, that's between you and God. But I can tell you this, that if we're able to do what we've set out to do, bring two cultures together, maybe more than that, they will know that there is a God at 10200 James A. Reed Road. Because I can tell you, the challenge we have is the greatest that exists today. Is it too big to miss or too big to hit? It's too big to miss. And that's the way David looked at it. All of those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword, not by the spear, it's not by Chain, it's not by Gary, it's not by Malik, it's not by the elders, it's not by the deacons, it's by the Lord. The battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. Finally, the Philistine starts to move closer to attack him. Okay, so we know he wasn't like blind or anything. But he did stand in one place an awful long time. And of course, he moved pretty slow because he's a big guy, so he's taking big steps, but he's moving kind of slow. David runs quickly toward the battle line to meet him. He reaches into his bag, and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with the sling and the stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine. And there's a little bit of debate here about, it says killed him, but there's some debate here about whether or not the stone killed him or whether or not he's killed by the sword. And I tend to think of it in terms of the sword, because David said, I'm going to cut your head off. And I don't know about you, but getting hit in the head with a stone, that's pretty serious. But whether that will kill somebody, we don't know. We know a sword will kill somebody. Now, if I were David, now think about this, or if you were David, and you hit Goliath in the head, right in the forehead, and he fell down, okay, unconscious, what would you do? If it was me, I would have said, I knocked him down, now you go check and see if he's dead. Right, Malik? Yeah, it's like you get out on the football field and it's like, okay, Malik, you see that big guy over there? You take him. I'll take the little guy over here. But David didn't do that. He ran up and then he took Goliath's sword. Now, this is a pretty good sized sword. And he cuts Goliath's head off. Now, at that point, we know he's dead. Whether he was dead before or not, probably unimportant. We know that he was dead then. And he stands over him. And he cuts his head off. And when the Philistines saw their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Now, why did they turn and run? I mean, they still had the same number of people. Israelites still had their army. Because the fact is that neither army was about to go down into the valley. They were just going to stand around for weeks probably and shout at each other. They didn't have a howitzer or an airplane or whatever. They couldn't call in an airstrike. So basically what happened was, once their champion was done, they took off because they're going, well, hey, this is not going any further, so we're out of here. And then the Israelites wisely ran after them, and you know the rest of the story. So as Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, and this is important, this is part of the story sometimes we leave out, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, as surely as you live, O king, I don't know. The king said, find out who this son is. So he goes and finds out, and he discovers that David is the son of Jesse of where? Bethlehem. David was in the lineage of Jesus. David was born to be a king. He was already in line. Now, was David all about his kingdom, all about God's kingdom? And when I got to Israel back in 1985 with our seminary group, we went to see Jerusalem. It's a pretty big city. My thought was, well, when David took charge, he had all this big city. No, he didn't. They showed us how big David's fortress was. It was barely a fourth of the city. If you saw a map, you'd see a map of Jerusalem, and down here in the corner, you just draw a little square. That was David's kingdom. It's not like he inherited the world. It's not like he had a huge kingdom. Yeah, I mean, he didn't have to pay taxes. That's good. He got to marry a pretty girl. He got a lot of money. But I can tell you right now, he did not have a big kingdom. And David made several mistakes, but it always came back to one thing, and that is, this has got to be about God's kingdom. He made lots of mistakes. And what did God say about David? Here is a man after my own heart. This is what we have to become. We have to become people after God's own heart. And let me tell you something. Why have we sung that song, red and yellow, black and white, He is precious as a sight, and we still don't follow it? We sang that song so much. It's easy, I guess, to look at the world and say, yeah, God loves the world and I love the world. But when it comes down to individuals, well, you haven't met my neighbor. Or what about this, the way this person does this? Or what about the way this person does that? If we're someone after God's own heart, we've got nothing to lose. We've got everything to gain. Everything's going to be way too big to miss. Because we become open and accepting and interested and willing to dialogue, to learn from each other. I don't care what the culture is, what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter. I want to tell you something. It's very, very easy to find a brown-skinned person in this book. It is not easy to find a white-skinned person in this book. Now, I'm only saying that to say that we need to understand that it's not about that. It's never been about that. If anything, Jesus came to prove that it's not about that. It's not about religion. It's not about a church building. It's not about anything else except one thing, and that is His kingdom. And that's what David did. And he had a little old bitty kingdom, and he said, God, your kingdom is everywhere. I'm just a little old king sitting here making mistakes, and I just want you to stay with me. Now, I probably prayed that prayer in one way or another for a long time. Just want you to just stick around. I mean, I'm stepping on my toes all the time. I'm opening my mouth just to exchange my feet. I'm messing up everything, this, that, and the other. We all are there. And why are we so judgmental? Why are we so... I don't get it. I just don't understand. Why we can't sit down and just listen to each other. For heaven's sakes. We're not going to agree on everything. So what? So what? We have difference of opinion. That's new. David was a man after God's own heart. And that's why God stuck with him through all of his mistakes. I know that over the years there have been lots of mistakes been made. But the reason why God has stuck with us, and Wayne always reminds me to say us and we and all that, because it's true. I'm in this with you too. But the reason why He has stuck with us is because it's not about our mistakes. It's about us learning to have a heart after Him. You can say yes. Yes. Let's pray.